It was a dark and stormy night in a small town in Mexico City, DF. Carlos had taken up a job as a security guard at the local cemetery, hoping to make some extra money to support his family. He had heard rumors of the cemetery being haunted, but he dismissed them as just stories told by superstitious locals. On his first night on the job, Carlos patrolled the graveyard, ensuring that everything was in order. It was a quiet night, and he found himself growing bored. However, that all changed when he stumbled upon a group of people performing a strange ritual. At first, Carlos thought they were just teenagers messing around. But as he got closer, he saw that they were performing witchcraft. He could feel a sense of unease growing within him, but he brushed it off and continued his patrol. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. Shadows moved on their own, objects were misplaced, and eerie noises echoed through the cemetery. Carlos tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. On one particularly stormy night, Carlos was patrolling the grounds when he heard a blood-curdling scream coming from one of the mausoleums. He ran towards the source of the sound, but when he arrived at the mausoleum, he found it to be completely empty. As he stood there, drenched in rain and shaking with fear, he noticed a shadowy figure out of the corner of his eye. When he turned to face it, he saw a woman in a white dress standing before him. Her eyes glowed with a spectral light, and she seemed to be floating a few inches off the ground. Carlos was paralyzed with fear, but the ghostly woman didn't seem to be interested in harming him. She simply stood there, staring at him with her glowing eyes, before slowly fading away into the night. As the nights went on, Carlos found himself becoming increasingly unsettled by the strange occurrences that he was witnessing. Objects would move on their own, doors would creak open and shut by themselves, and cold gusts of wind would seem to blow through the cemetery out of nowhere. Another night, Carlos was walking through a particularly old section of the cemetery when he heard what sounded like whispers coming from one of the tombs. He cautiously approached the tomb, and as he got closer, he realized that the whispers were coming from inside the tomb itself. He drew his flashlight and shone it inside the tomb, illuminating the darkness. There, he saw a group of ghostly figures huddled together, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They seemed to be chanting something in an unknown language, and Carlos could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up in terror. As he backed away from the tomb, Carlos saw yet another ghostly figure approaching him. This one was a man with a haggard face and sunken eyes. He seemed to be beckoning Carlos to follow him, and despite his better judgment, Carlos found himself drawn towards the ghostly figure. The man led Carlos to a forgotten section of the cemetery, where he showed him a crumbling tombstone. On the tombstone was a name that Carlos recognized. It was the name of one of his ancestors. The ghostly man then disappeared into the night, leaving Carlos standing alone in the dark. Carlos realized that the ghosts of his ancestors were trying to communicate with him, warning him of the dangers that lurked in the cemetery. As the nights wore on, Carlos witnessed more and more ghostly encounters. He saw a ghostly figure hovering over a grave, its eyes glowing in the dark. He saw groups of ghostly apparitions congregating around the graves of deceased loved ones. He even witnessed a full-blown apparition of a young girl who seemed to be lost and confused. Despite the warnings and the haunting encounters, Carlos continued to work as a security guard at the cemetery. He knew that he was being watched by the ghosts and the witches, but he also knew that he had to confront his fears and stand up to them. One night, Carlos witnessed a particularly gruesome sight. A group of satanic worshippers had gathered in the cemetery, and they were performing a ritual sacrifice. Carlos watched in horror as the group slaughtered a live chicken, smearing its blood all over their bodies and chanting in an unknown language. It was then that Carlos realized that he was in the midst of a creepypasta story. The ghosts and witches were not just figments of his imagination. They were real, and they were out to scare him off the Holy Lands. Carlos knew that he had to fight back. He stood his ground, staring down the ghostly figures and the satanic worshippers. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished into thin air. From that moment on, Carlos knew that he had become a part of the lore of the cemetery. He had faced the ghosts and the witches, and he had emerged victorious. But he also knew that he could never shake off the feeling that he was being watched, and that the cemetery would always hold secrets that were beyond his comprehension. As the years went by, Carlos continued to work as a security guard at the cemetery, but he never forgot the ghostly encounters that he had experienced. He passed the stories down to his children and grandchildren, and the legends of the haunted cemetery lived on for generations to come. The cemetery itself remained shrouded in mystery, and the ghosts and witches continued to haunt the grounds, searching for unsuspecting visitors to scare off their holy lands.